turn our live stream on, and then we'll have a prayer. Jonathan, can I get you to lead us in a word of prayer?
Let's all bow together. Lord God, we come before you this evening, Lord. We thank you so much for all you've done for us, Lord, each and every day. Lord, we know all good things come from your hand, Lord, and we thank you for those. And Lord, we pray that you be with us this evening as we open up your word and we learn more about what's going on with the times today. We pray that we can learn from that and apply things to our lives and learn how we can live our lives more pleasing to you, Lord. And Lord, we pray that you continue to guard and protect us from the sickness, Lord, that's going around. We pray that you will keep our elderly from getting sick, keep us all from getting sick, Lord. And we pray that you be with our nation through these times as it tries to figure out how to make ends meet, Lord. We pray that you will guard and protect us through all this, Lord. And Lord, we mentioned a great number this evening that are dealing with health issues, who are going to deal with surgeries, Lord. We pray that your hand will be with each one of them, that you can help heal and help make things better for them. And Lord, we pray that you be with each one of us as we go in our lives. Help us remember that hope that we have of going to heaven with you, Lord, that we keep our hope fixed on that we can constantly remind ourselves of that this world isn't what it's all about, it's about the future, Lord. And we thank you for that opportunity you extend to us for that. Lord, for all these things, in Christ's name, amen.
Amen. All right. Well, welcome everyone, and welcome those who may be viewing from YouTube on our live stream. Tonight we're in 2 Samuel. We'll be studying verses or chapters 1 through 4. I just want to thank everyone for being here tonight, and thank you for your devotion and study. We'll be picking up in our study where we left off. We left off in 1 Samuel chapter 31 with the death of Saul and Jonathan. And as we pick up tonight in our study in the second book of Samuel, what we're going to see tonight in in chapters 1 through 4, a lot of things consisting of what's wrong with the world at the time when this was written, at the time when David was coming to an end of a struggle that he had been enduring for a very long time. You're going to see the grief of someone, for someone who was a friend, and the grief for someone who was an enemy. You're going to see murder. You're going to read about politics. You're going to read about a lot of things that exist in our world today and existed during the time of David before and as he takes over as king. So in 2 Samuel chapter 1, the first section of 2 Samuel continues the narrative by describing David's ascendancy as king over Israel. And there, on the third day, after returning to Ziklag, an Amalekite approached David's camp. And he had some very important information for David. And what was that information? The death of Saul. That's right. And as we read in the text, the Amalekite was describing the death of Saul and Jonathan as if he had been there. What did he provide as proof that he was there and that he told David that he had killed Saul or finished him off? And what did he provide as proof to David that he was telling the truth? That's right. He provided the crown and the bracelet. Now, something to think about. Has David been crowned king of Israel yet? No, he hasn't. He was anointed at one time when he was much younger, but now he goes through a more formal process within these 4 chapters of being anointed as king and being crowned as king. What I find interesting, and that there are small things that can be viewed as big things sometimes, and they pass right by us. But many times we read this text and we don't realize where's the Amalekite? What is his descendants? He's a descendant of who? Edom. Yeah. And not always favorable in the sight of Israel, but in order to be king, a king has to have a crown. How ironic for an Amalekite, although we know he's not telling the truth from the account in 1 Samuel 31, how ironic for an Amalekite to bring the crown to David. Let that be a lesson to all of us that God uses men, whether they be good people or whether they be bad, to orchestrate what he needs to happen. David's got to have a crown as a king, and here's a guy that's bringing it to him. Now that Amalekite doesn't realize what his fate is going to be. But I want you to notice something in chapter 12 as we pick up in verse 11. Then David took hold of his clothes and tore them, and so also did all the men who were with him. They mourned and wept and fasted until evening for Saul and his son Jonathan, and for the people of the Lord and the house of Israel, because they had fallen by the sword. David said to the young man who told him, "Where are you from?" And he said, "I am the son of an alien, an Amalekite." Now let's stop there for a moment. There's always a tendency to react to information and react to it quickly. Okay? If you see something that is wrong right away, what's the first thing that you want to do? You want to deal with it right then. It is right this is wrong, and I'm going to deal with it right now. But notice in the text that David does not immediately deal with the Amalekite. That the first thing that he does is he mourns for the king of Israel that was killed and for his friend Jonathan. And as it points out, they mourned and wept and fasted until evening. So that gives you the indication that after he gets the information from the Amalekite, depending on what part of the day that he received it, that it was well into the evening until David made the decision to deal with the Amalekite. Now, we don't know if David really knew that the Amalekite was lying. And we don't know if David ever found out something different than what we read about in 1 Samuel 31. All we know is that there is a man standing before David telling him something that, according to the account of 1 Samuel 31, is not true. Why is he telling David this? What could be his motivation?
Saul had been chasing David, and everybody knew that he was trying to kill David. And so he was thinking, I'm going to get him because I'm going to bring the news that his enemy is dead.
That's right. If you couldn't hear Catherine, she's just accounted for the relationship with Saul and David, and how Saul, it was no secret that Saul was chasing David all over the place. I mean, from one corner of the earth to the other, and it was common knowledge that Saul was jealous and hated David. And here's this Amalekite that comes up and says, I am sure to get me a reward out of this one today. I'm going to walk up here. I got the crown in my hand, and I got the bracelet in my hand, and I'm going to walk up and embellish a little bit on, and maybe, he had the crown and he had the bracelet. So he was in the presence of Saul, either fatally wounded or dead. That's your proof right there. He says, I'm going to embellish on this a little bit, and I'm going to see if I can ingratiate myself to the future king, and maybe possibly I'll get a reward out of this. There's no other motivation for doing what he did. And here another thing that we begin to learn about the way we conduct ourselves often in our life. Human beings are the world's worst. There's no other species that loves to embellish more than we do. We love to hear stories. We not only love to hear stories, we love to tell them. And all of us have probably embellished a little bit on something at some point in our life. And while every now and then, a story that would make us laugh and something that brings charm to the conversation might be delightful, when it comes to telling the truth, we need to stick with the facts, tell the truth, and not get caught in a situation where we're trying to make ourselves look better. We do that as human beings, just like this Amalekite did. We seize an opportunity. And while I don't know that about anybody in here, I'm a human being myself, and so are you. And if there's anyone here who has never embellished on a story before, I'll sit down and I'll let you teach, because we've all done it, one way or the other. And maybe we got caught at it, maybe we didn't. But over in Matthew, the 5th chapter, it is a divinely inspired piece of advice. And since I have the microphone up here, I'll read it for us. Matthew 5, 34 through 37. But I say to you, make no oath at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by the earth, for it is the footstool of his feet, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great King. Nor shall you make an oath by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. But let your statement be yes. But let your statement be yes, yes, or no, no. Anything beyond these is of evil. So a lesson learned and greatly inspired advice that's also repeated over in James, the 5th chapter, word for word. Let your yes be yes, let your no be no. Okay, any comments before we move on from that story? Okay, so I'm going to be flipping back and forth. We're still in our lesson book, 1st and 2nd Samuel by Mike Willis. So I'm following some questions in the back of this lesson right here. So in David's lamentation over the death of Saul and Jonathan, how did he describe the two men? That's right. And let's read the text here to coincide with the comment Randy just made about the relationships that David had with both of these men. So after he kills the Amalekite for striking down the Lord's anointed. Now, this is Saul was a guy that pursued David to the far reaches, all over the country. And David twice had an opportunity to kill Saul. So you wouldn't expect, as human beings, for him to lavish praise on Saul as much as he did Jonathan. Jonathan was his friend, and he expresses great love for Jonathan, but yet he shows great respect for Saul as well. They mourn for him. So in the text, here's some of the things that it says. Your beauty, O Israel, is slain on your high places. How have the mighty fallen? From the blood of the slain, from the fat of the mighty, The bow of Jonathan did not turn back, and the sword of Saul did not return empty. Saul and Jonathan, verse 23, beloved and pleasant in their life, and in their death they were not parted. They were swifter than eagles, they were stronger than lions. What a very poetic description of two men. And you would think, if you've never read anything about this story before, you would think that Saul and David were great friends as much as they were Jonathan, but that was not the case, was it? So how do you explain David's view of his enemies in the Psalms and what he wanted the Lord to do to his enemies in Psalms? And we'll read a few of those passages, and what Saul did to him, and how he finally mourned Saul and made the comments that he did about him. How do you reconcile all of that? Ralph is saying Saul is God's anointed.
He had great respect for the office. And like Ralph said, because he was anointed of God. And I think it's a good lesson for us that we respect the office. We may disagree. I can't imagine the feelings David had at times with Saul. But he respected him because he was God's anointed.
That's right. That's right. And Buddy brings up a good point about respecting the office. That's one of the biggest things that our society is missing today. There's wrong on both sides. Okay? Let me say that right now. There's wrong on both sides, whether you're Republican or Democrat. There is a vitriol today between political parties that no longer respect themselves nor the office in which the president holds. There have been a number of presidents that we've experienced over our lifetime. I can't remember ever seeing this much disrespect for the office of president. And like I said, I've had presidents I disliked, and I do not support or did not support their agendas. But if someone invited me to the White House to greet the president, or if the president came to town, a president in which I disagreed with, he's still the president of the United States. And as Christians, we can find all sorts of scriptures that compel us to respect local authorities and kings and governments and their representatives. And what's going on today is just, in many ways, absolutely embarrassing. But David shows great respect and honors the king because, as Ralph points out, that was the Lord's anointed. Now let's look at a few things here together. And I'm going to ask that Trey, if you would, read Psalms 7:6. Eric, would you read, I'll read that one. Read 1 Peter 4:8. And Ryan Baker, can I get you to read Luke 6:27? Psalm 7:6.
Arise, O Lord, in your anger. Lift yourself up because of the rage of my enemies. Rise up for me to the judgment you have commanded.
Okay, there are a number of Psalms, especially if you ever, we've studied the Psalms recently. Chapter 18 has a number of comments by David about God thwarting his enemies, the destruction of his enemies. How we reconcile that is that, like we've pointed out many times before, David goes to God and petitions God to deal with his enemies. That's another reason to go along with Ralph's comment as to why he never returned the negative favor to Saul. One, he was God's anointed. Two, David goes to God and asks God to deal with his enemies. Okay? 1 Peter 4:8.
1 Peter 4:8, above all, keep loving one another earnestly, since love covers a multitude of sins.
Okay, a scripture that we go to all the time, love covers a multitude of sins, but we don't often apply it to somebody who naturally makes us mad or treats us unfairly. In fact, we, as human beings, we start throwing scriptures out the window when we're wronged in some way because we either passively ignore the person out of spite or we do something else to spite them as human beings. It's a natural behavior when you don't follow the Word of God. And I want you to look over in 1 Corinthians, the 13th chapter. And as I was studying this and preparing for the lesson, it dawned on me that David, in expressing his love for Jonathan, he could have mourned for Jonathan only, but he mourned for Saul as well, as we've said. And when we look at 1 Corinthians 13, it's the chapter we're all familiar with about the excellence of love, particularly in verse 5. Love does not act unbecomingly. It does not seek its own, is not provoked, does not take into account a wrong suffered, does not rejoice in unrighteousness, but rejoices in the truth, bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things. In spite of the way he'd been treated, David was still devoted to God, and if God made the choice for Saul to be king, he's still in line with God's elect. He's going to follow what God has him to do and say and look to him for guidance. And for him, let's say that in contrast, if David sought to disparage the name of Saul and lift up Jonathan, would he be acting unbecomingly? Would he be seeking his own? Would he be provoked? If he did the opposite of what he did in mourning for Saul and mourning, well, of course he mourned for Jonathan, but if he did the opposite, it is in stark contrast to what God would have us to be as a people. If I have the gift of prophecy and know all the mysteries and all the knowledge, and if I have all the faith so as to remove mountains but do not have love, I am nothing. If David was the greatest king in the world, and we know that he's going to make some mistakes, so we already have a peek into that. But if he did all of that, and he conquered all of his enemies, but yet did not show respect to God's chosen one, his anointed one, and disparaged his name, it would fly in the face of these passages. Yes, sir.
We did a lesson before all this stuff happened. You might recall, it's called Take the Action of Love. And I think we see David fulfilling that. Love is not feelings that we have, but the actions we choose to take. What kind of feelings do you think David had for Saul at this point? He probably was resentful, probably angered, but yet he chose still to respect and love him because he loved the person, not the sins that he was committing.
That's
And
right.
I think that's what we got to remember.
That's right. It's all about action. I can't look at you and love you and yet and tell you I love you and yet not treat you respectfully. Those two just don't go together. But there's another passage in Proverbs, the 24th chapter. So I'll turn over to Proverbs 24. And Eric has been doing a great job at his study in Proverbs, and I look forward to more in that. And the book of Proverbs is a great book. I've heard the book of Proverbs called a rule of thumb before. don't think so. It's divinely inspired, great advice. And in verse 17 of chapter 24, do not rejoice when your enemy falls, and do not let your heart be glad when he stumbles. Or the Lord will see it and be displeased, and turn his anger away from him. So we see a very compelling warning there. Don't rejoice when your enemy falls. Who wrote Proverbs, by the way? Sir? Solomon? Yeah. Solomon, who's the son of David. And it's not ironic that we find that kind of advice, divinely inspired advice here in Proverbs, which fits David perfectly. He never rejoiced in the death of Saul. He was saddened and he was very moved. Now, as we move into chapter 2, let me make sure we don't have any other questions or comments before we move from there. Yes, sir. Yes, Romans 14, good chapter that's applicable for that. Okay, thank you for that. All right, so we go into chapter 2. And here's where we get into some very dicey politics that results in murder and death and some very unseemly things that go on. Now, in chapter 2, verses 1 through 11, David does something that Abner doesn't do in chapter 2, verse 12, through to chapter 3, verse 1. What does David do that separates him and sets him apart from what Abner does? Look in the very first verse of chapter 2. That's right. He inquired of the Lord. Now, I contrast that because you have a man that's going to be king, and you have a man that wants to be king. The man that's going to be king will be king because God said he will be king. Abner seeks to take Saul's son Ishbosheth and orchestrate a political takeover of Israel, while David takes Judah. He's going to make Ishbosheth king over Israel. And while David inquires of the Lord as to what he should do next, Abner never inquires of the Lord at all. Which, even if he did, maybe they would have avoided, if you read the text, maybe they would have avoided all the bloodshed and all of the problems and all of the political struggles if Abner had inquired of the Lord like David was doing. Abner would have soon found out that Saul's son is not meant to be king. So at the end, when we get to chapter 4, what happens? Does Ishbosheth rise to prominence? No, he doesn't. In fact, he becomes very weak and feeble. He loses the strength, and they kill him. And what does Abner end up doing? What does he give to David? Gives him the keys to the car because he's not big enough to drive it. And he learned, hopefully, he learned a valuable lesson in that situation. But the lesson for us, the many lessons that we find, and this is a good example of David again. Again, going back to chapter 1, did he immediately have somebody kill the Amalekite? No, it wasn't immediate. Waited till evening. And then he decided, who are you to strike down the Lord's anointed, execute this guy? And then, when we get to chapter 2, then it came about afterwards that David inquired of the Lord, saying, shall I go up to one of the cities of Judah? And the Lord said to him, go up. So David said, where shall I go up? And he said, to Hebron. It is so, elementary in the dialogue between him and God. But does our relationship with God and how we pray to God and talk to God sometimes have to be some fancy eloquation of complicated words or anything like that? Sometimes this dialogue between David and God is very simple. He said, what should I do? Well, you should go here. Well, where do I go? Just simple questions. It reminds you of Abraham, doesn't it? And how Abraham just blindly followed God because he trusted him. And wherever God told him to go, that's where Abraham went. Any comments or things that you have to add?